conference room on the 14th floor had floor-to-ceiling windows that looked out over downtown Indianapolis. I know that because I spent 28 years watching the skyline change from those windows, the old bank building that came down in 2009, the hotel that went up in 2014, the construction crane that seemed permanently fixed on the horizon for the last 3 years. I knew every detail of that view the way you know the face of someone you've lived with for decades. I was sitting in my usual chair, third from the left, when my new boss walked in and told me I was done. Not privately. Not with a handshake and a severance package slid across a desk. In front of 42 people, including 2 interns who'd been with the company for 6 weeks and a vendor from our Chicago office who was there to demo new procurement software. My new boss, I'll call her Brenda, stood at the head of the table with her hands folded in front of her like she was delivering a quarterly earnings report, and she said, "Miles, your role is being eliminated. HR will meet with you at 3 o'clock. We appreciate your contributions." That was it. 28 years. We appreciate your contributions. The coffee in my thermos was still hot. I remember that because I looked down at it when she said my name, and steam was still curling off the surface. I don't know why that detail stuck. Maybe because everything else in the room felt surreal, and the coffee was the only thing that felt real. Nobody said a word. 42 people, and not one of them said a single word. I was 54 years old. I had started at Halloran Industrial as a junior compliance analyst 6 months after my daughter was born. I'd worked my way up to Director of Regulatory Affairs over the course of almost 3 decades. I knew our federal contracts inside and out, the language, the requirements, the deadlines, the specific clauses that had been negotiated with DoD and EPA and half a dozen other agencies over the years. I had personally shepherded a $340 million federal contract renewal through 18 months of regulatory review in 2019. I had flown to Washington 11 times in 1 year. My wife, Connie, had kept a calendar on the fridge to track when I'd be home. None of that was in the room when Brenda said my name. I should back up. Brenda had arrived 8 months earlier as our new Chief Operations Officer, brought in by the board after we'd been acquired by a private equity group out of New York called Meridian Capital Partners. She was 39. Had an MBA from Wharton, and had spent the previous 4 years restructuring a logistics company in Atlanta. She was sharp, no question. In her first week, she had reorganized 2 departments, canceled 3 vendor contracts, and introduced a productivity tracking system that measured output in 30-minute increments. She also had very clear ideas about what kind of people she wanted around her, and I was not that kind of people she wanted around her, and I was not that kind of people. My crime, as far as I could tell, was that I asked too many questions. Not obstinate questions, not insubordinate ones. Compliance questions, the kind that are literally the core of my job. When Brenda proposed accelerating our bid timeline for a new Department of Energy contract, I raised concerns in a meeting about Section 12B disclosure requirements. When she proposed a change to our environmental reporting format, I flagged that the new format hadn't yet been approved by the regional EPA office. When she moved to restructure our documentation workflow, I noted in an email, a measured professional email, that the proposed change might create gaps in our audit trail. After that email, she stopped inviting me to certain meetings. Then she moved my office from the 14th floor to the 12th. Then she reassigned 2 of my direct reports without consulting me. I am not stupid. I understood what was happening. I had watched it happen to other people at other companies over the years. The new leadership comes in, identifies the people who slow things down by asking questions, and starts moving them toward the exit. The actual firing is just the last step. The architecture of the exit starts long before. What I didn't anticipate was the public nature of it. Looking back, I think that was intentional. Brenda wanted everyone in that room to understand that her authority was absolute, and that resistance, even polite, procedural resistance, had consequences. It was a message delivered through me to everyone else. I stood up. I picked up my thermos and my legal pad. I did not say anything because there was nothing to say. In that room, in that moment, in front of 42 witnesses and 2 interns and a man from Chicago who was there to talk about procurement software. I walked out. In the hallway, one of my colleagues, a guy named Roy who'd been in our engineering division for 15 years, caught up to me. He put his hand on my shoulder and said, "Miles, this isn't right." I told him I was fine. "You have a number I can reach you at." I gave him my cell phone. We stood there for a second. Then I walked to the elevator. The drive home was 40 minutes. Connie's car was in the driveway. She works from home on Tuesdays. I sat in my truck for a few minutes before I went inside. We have a red maple in the front yard that my father-in-law planted when our daughter was born. It was October and the leaves were at peak color, that deep red orange that only lasts about a week before they start to fall. I thought about how I had taken a photo of that tree every October for 28 years. I had a whole folder of them on my laptop. My daughter, Lily, used to think that was the most boring hobby imaginable. I went inside and told Connie. She didn't say anything for a long moment. Then she said, "Tell me what you need." That was the right thing to say. It was the only right thing to say. I spent the next week doing what you're supposed to do. I updated my resume. I reached out to my professional network. I filed the paperwork for my severance. 12 weeks, which for 28 years of service felt like a bad joke. But that was what the contract said. I called our financial advisor to go over our situation. We were okay. Not forever okay, but okay for now. Lily was in her second year at Purdue, and her tuition was covered through a combination of savings and the merit scholarship she'd earned. That had been the plan we'd built everything around for the last 4 years, and it was holding. What I did not do was tell anyone what I knew. Here's what I knew. Viridian Capital Partners had been in negotiations for 7 months with a defense contractor out of Northern Virginia called Ashford Dynamics. The deal was structured as a full acquisition. Viridian buying Halloran Industrial and then immediately bundling it with 2 other portfolio companies in a package sale to Ashford. The total transaction value was approximately $1.4 billion. The deal was expected to close in 30 days. I knew about it because the regulatory compliance review for a transaction of that size, involving federal contractors with active DoD contracts, requires extensive documentation. I had been part of the preliminary compliance team before Brenda started quietly edging me out. I had reviewed the disclosure schedules. I had flagged 3 items for further review. I had written a formal memo about one specific issue, a legacy environmental covenant attached to our Terre Haute facility that carried ongoing reporting obligations under a 1997 consent decree with the Indiana Department of Environmental Management. The covenant was unusual. It required that any new ownership structure be disclosed to IDEEM within 60 days of closing, and that a designated compliance officer, specifically named and credentialed, certify the transition documents. The consent decree was old, predating most of our current systems, and it had been grandfathered through 2 previous ownership changes with appropriate documentation. I was the designated compliance officer of record on that covenant. Had been since 2011. My memo had outlined this clearly. It noted that the sale to Ashford would trigger the disclosure requirement and that I would need to execute the certification documents as part of the closing process. Without my signature, the transition certification couldn't be completed. Without the certification, the environmental covenant would be in technical violation. A violation of a federal consent decree, even a technical one, would materially affect the representations in the acquisition agreement. Brenda had received that memo. I had confirmation she'd opened the email. She fired me anyway. I don't know if she didn't understand the implications or if she understood them and decided the problem could be solved some other way. Or if she simply didn't care because she had the authority to not care. What I know is that nobody from Halloran, from Viridian Capital, or from their legal team reached out to me in the weeks following my termination. Not one call, not one email. I was starting to think maybe I'd overstated the problem. Compliance issues and complex transactions get resolved all the time. Maybe they'd found a workaround. Maybe there was a successor designation provision I hadn't considered. I started to let it go. 22 days after I was walked out of that 14th-floor conference room, I was in my garage reorganizing a shelf of paint cans, the kind of pointless task you invent when you don't know what to do with yourself, when my cell phone rang. Unknown number. Indianapolis area code. I almost didn't pick up. Miles. The voice was male, controlled, the particular flatness of someone who was accustomed to being the most important person in any room. "This is Garrett Finch. I'm the general counsel at Ashford Dynamics." I set down the can of Dextane. "We have a situation," he said, "that I believe you're aware of." He explained it to me in the careful, precise language of someone who has spent a career choosing words for liability reasons. The transaction had proceeded through closing. The certification documents had been submitted with a signature from Brenda, who was not, had never been, and could not retroactively be designated as the compliance officer of record under the terms of the 1997 consent decree. IDM had reviewed the submission and rejected it. They had issued a notice of violation and placed a 30-day hold on the facility's operational status. The hold had triggered a material adverse change clause in the acquisition agreement. Ashford's board was meeting in 72 hours to decide whether to invoke that clause and exit the deal. A $1.4 billion transaction was sitting on a knife's edge because of a document I hadn't signed. "We'd like to discuss whether there's a path forward," Garrett Finch said. I stood in my garage with a can of Dextain in one hand and my cell phone in the other, and I looked at the shelf my father-in-law had built along the back wall when he came to help me finish the basement 16 years ago. He passed away in 2020. Good man. He would have laughed at this situation. He had a very specific appreciation for the ways that institutions that believed themselves to be unstoppable occasionally tripped over their own shoelaces. "I'm listening," I said. What followed was a week of conversations that I'll compress here because the legal mechanics are not the interesting part. What matters is this: the path forward required my participation. Not a workaround, not a successor designation, not a creative legal interpretation. Me, specifically, reviewing and certifying the transition documentation under the terms of the consent decree. I wasn't going to accept anything else. Garrett Finch was professional throughout. His team was professional. They sent a car to bring me to a meeting at a law firm in downtown Indianapolis. Not at Halloran's offices, I noticed. I met with their environmental counsel and their regulatory team. I reviewed the documentation they had prepared. I asked questions, some of which required additional documentation before I could be satisfied. They got me the documentation. They were, in my experience, unusually responsive. At our second meeting, I asked about the nature of any consulting arrangement they were envisioning. The number they offered was, I will say, not an insult. I also asked one other question. I asked whether Brenda would remain in her COO role under the new ownership structure. There was a pause. Not a long one, but noticeable. Garrett said that personnel decisions within Halloran were not within his purview to discuss. His tone suggested that the question had registered and that the answer, if he had one, was not something he was authorized to share. I signed the certification documents 3 days later. The Ashford acquisition closed. The IDEEM violation was resolved. The facility in Terre Haute resumed normal operations. I found out from Roy, who had stayed in touch through all of this, texting me periodically with updates from inside the building, that Brenda was gone within 6 weeks of the new ownership taking over. Roy wasn't certain of the details. He said she left on a Friday and her parking badge stopped working on Monday. The official communication said she had decided to pursue other opportunities. Roy's tone when he texted me this suggested he found the phrasing as apt as I did. I'm not going to pretend I felt nothing when I heard that. I would be lying if I said I didn't feel something. I am human. 28 years is a long time. Being stood up in front of 42 people and 2 interns and a man from Chicago and told that your contributions are appreciated, past tense, and that HR will see you at 3 o'clock. That doesn't just roll off you. It doesn't matter how calm you are in the moment. It lives somewhere in your chest for a while. But the thing I actually felt mostly was tired. Tired of having carried that knowledge around for a month, tired of waiting, tired of reorganizing paint cans in my garage. What I felt more than anything was relief. Ashford brought me on as a senior regulatory advisor. It's a consulting arrangement, which I have to say suits me in ways I didn't expect. I set my own hours. I work on the projects I choose to work on. I am no longer in charge of whether the new procurement software gets properly demoed to the right people, which is not my problem, which is a beautiful thing. Lily came home for Thanksgiving. She helped me rake the leaves from the red maple, which had come down in a spectacular drop over about 4 days in November, the way they sometimes do. We bagged 11 bags. She complained the entire time, which is her right as a 20-year-old. We had a good time. Connie made her mother's stuffing recipe, the one with the cornbread and the sage, which Connie insists is better than anyone else's stuffing in the state of Indiana, a claim I have never challenged because it is probably true. After dinner, Lily asked me if I was okay, not the polite version of that question, the real version, the one she asks with the same directness she has had since she was about 7 years old, and decided that being straightforward with people was more efficient than being indirect. I told her I was better than okay. She thought about that for a second. Then she said, "Mom told me what happened, the whole thing." I said yes. She said you stayed calm. I said I tried. Lily nodded, the way she does when she's processing something she doesn't entirely have words for yet. Then she said, "I'm proud of you, Dad. I have been in a lot of boardrooms. I have negotiated with federal regulators. I have sat across the table from attorneys whose firms bill at rates that would make your eyes water. I have presented to boards of directors and testified in 2 administrative proceedings and managed a team through a regulatory crisis that could have cost the company 9 figures. None of that prepared me for how much it meant to hear my daughter say that, in our kitchen, with the smell of Connie's stuffing still in the air. I have thought a lot since then about what the lesson is. People always want there to be a lesson, a clean takeaway, a principle you can extract and apply somewhere else. I've tried to find one. The best I have is this. The things that make you inconvenient are often the same things that make you indispensable. Asking the right questions at the wrong time is only a liability until it isn't. Brenda saw me as friction. It turned out the friction was load-bearing. I also think about the 42 people in that room who didn't say anything. I don't hold it against them. I know how it works. I know what happens to people who stand up in those moments. Roy caught me in the hallway, because Roy's the kind of person who catches people in hallways, and I am grateful for it. But I don't blame the others. Fear is a very rational response to a specific kind of power, and Brenda wielded that kind of power very deliberately. What I hope, and I mean this genuinely, without any satisfaction attached to it, is that some of them watched what happened and filed it away somewhere useful, that they remembered it the next time someone asked them to ignore something they knew mattered, that they thought, even briefly, about what it cost Brenda to believe that the rules were optional when you had enough authority. I don't know. I'm not inside their heads. I do know that I still drive past the Halloran building sometimes. I don't know why it's not on my way to anything. But I do. I look up at the 14th-floor windows where you can see the conference room if the blinds are open. I think about the view of the skyline. The construction crane is still up there, working on something new. I hope whoever is sitting in the 3rd chair from the left is having a decent morning. I hope their coffee is still hot. I've thought about what happened a lot over the past year. Not obsessively. I don't mean it that way. More like the way you turn a rock over in your hand after you find it on a trail. Just trying to understand the weight of it. What I keep coming back to is this. Brenda wasn't wrong to want efficiency. She wasn't wrong to want a leaner organization, or faster decisions, or people who moved at her pace. Those are legitimate things to want when you're brought in to run an operation. Where she went wrong, and I mean catastrophically, $1.4 billion wrong, was in mistaking inconvenience for incompetence. She saw me as friction and decided friction had no value. She never stopped to ask what the friction was actually doing. That's the thing about integrity in a technical role. It doesn't look impressive. It doesn't generate revenue or close deals or produce a slide with an upward arrow. What it does is quietly hold things together in ways that only become visible when it's gone. I spent 28 years building something that was essentially invisible, a web of certifications, documented processes, regulatory relationships, institutional memory that existed nowhere except in the work I had actually done and the credentials attached to my name. Brenda looked at that and saw a middle-aged man who asked too many questions. She was not entirely wrong about what she saw. She was entirely wrong about what it meant. I also think about what it took to walk out of that room without saying anything. People have asked me about that. Roy asked me about it. Connie asked me about it. Lily asked me about it over Thanksgiving. How did you not say something? And honestly, in the moment, it wasn't discipline or strategy. It was more that I understood, with a clarity I hadn't expected, that there was nothing worth saying. Not because I was defeated, but because the room had already decided what it believed and I wasn't going to change that in the next 30 seconds. What I could control was how I left. I chose to leave like someone who knew exactly what he was worth and didn't need the room to confirm it. That's not something I could have done at 35, maybe not even at 45. It's something that 28 years of doing the actual work teaches you, slowly and without announcing itself, until one morning you find out you have it. The other thing I've thought about is Lily saying she was proud of me. I have turned that over more than anything else. Because the honest truth is that I spent most of her childhood being proud of myself for the things that happened at the office, the contracts I managed, the crises I navigated, the deals that closed. I measured myself in professional outcomes. And at 54, standing in my own kitchen, the thing that landed hardest was my 20-year-old daughter looking at me and valuing not the outcome, but who I was inside it, how I carried myself when it cost something to carry myself that way. That's the only lesson I know how to offer. Not that patience is always rewarded, because it isn't. not on any reliable schedule. Not that the truth always wins, because that's not how institutions work. Just this. The way you handle the thing that is happening to you, especially when it is unjust and public and humiliating, that becomes part of who you are in a permanent way. Brenda's decision told everyone in that room something about her. My exit told them something about me. We both got to choose what that something was. I chose the only way I knew how to. I walked out with my thermos and my legal pad, and I drove home to my wife. The rest followed from there.